Oh, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're here to, this class is on George Schuyler, and I'm very excited to hear this class. I never met Mr. Schuyler, but I knew people who knew him very well, and I consider him a brilliant man, and we would love to publish some of his writings. At some point we plan to do that. And how I met Dr. Mary Graybar was, I was doing a little research. I had the portrait of him on the lower right, which was used as a front cover of the now defunct American Opinion magazine. It's now called The New American, but the American Opinion itself is no longer published. And the author, the painter, he would paint portraits of famous Americans, mostly conservative patriots, and they went up for sale. I got it for a few dollars, and I wanted to donate it to some worthy entity that may have put this in some place that should be where he should be recognized and acknowledged. And I ended up finding his great article about George Schuyler, written by this lady by the name of Mary Graybar. And I emailed her, and we connected that way. And then she told me about the biography that she was writing. I said, this is exciting. So has not been published yet. But we also connected in the wake of last year's riots. She wrote this great book about Howard Zinn, which she talked about earlier today, and the Columbus statues being torn down and such. So that's how I think I invited you to come to camp 2 years ago, and you said, I'll try to make it. That's when we were in Western Massachusetts, so we're very delighted that she could make it this year. And so without further ado, Mary.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, as I've told some of you, I've been working on this biography for 10 years now. I started in 2011. I had a research fellowship at the Alexander Hamilton Institute for the Study of Western Civilization, where I now reside. And I went through George Schuyler's papers in the month of July. And as much as I have been able to, I've been writing about him. I've contributed some essays about him to a couple collections. I've done one academic paper on him. And I feel like I've gotten to know him. My book is about 90% done, and I've been frustrated because, at first I couldn't find a publisher. Then I wrote these two other books, and Schuyler is always there. And I feel like I've gotten to know him quite well, and I am so glad to be here. I really just feel his presence here. You are his people, and hello, George Schuyler. We are here. We're talking about you. You have not been forgotten. So he was a great man, a great thinker, a great writer, a great American. He should be a role model to young people. His writings should be taught instead of Nicole Hannah Jones's writings. He would peg her in a New York Minute. You're a communist. You have this racket going. He loved that word, a racket. A hustler, right? Anytime, because there was a lot of rioting in the 60s, and he was, talking about the radicals and the Marxists who were stirring things up in his community in Harlem, which was at one time the most, a very prosperous, fashionable area of New York City, and he saw it decay through the decades. But for those, how many of you know about George Schuyler? Because I've prepared kind of a brief biography, but how many of you don't know? Okay, so I'll go through this. So, the picture is here. This is George Schuyler. Okay, so George Schuyler was born in Providence, Rhode Island in 1895. As an infant, he was moved with his family to Syracuse, New York, and that's where he grew up. And that's where his papers are now. There are others at the Schomburg Center in New York City. He went to public schools. He was about one of 2 or 3 black students in an all-white school. He did well. He got along with his teachers, and he started writing even as a boy. He wrote these satirical sketches of his teachers. He doesn't say that in his autobiography, but there's an oral history that I've gotten, and he said that to William Ingersoll in 1960. His family was very bourgeois, middle class. They stuck to patriotic American principles. They were very much a minority in Syracuse. There were very few blacks in Syracuse at the time. I think they made up less than 1% of the population. But he had kind of a Victorian upbringing. And if you read his autobiography, if you can get it, you'll see that his family prided themselves, along with all the other families on the block, by going through the chores by the day of the week. So you could tell if it was Monday because that's when laundry was being hung out. You could tell it was Friday because that's when the baking was done. He has these delightful stories, especially of his grandmother, and he really brings people to life. He has that gift. And he got along with, he had white friends, but around the time he was a teenager, he found himself excluded from activities of his white friends, and he noticed that for a black person in Syracuse, there wasn't much opportunity. And at the age of 14, the Army had come into town to do their maneuvers, and he was very much impressed by watching these soldiers. And they talked about going off to the far-off lands, and they'd been in Mexico, the Philippines, and everywhere else. And so he joined the Army at the age of 17. His mother signed his papers, lied about his age, and she unfortunately died 3 months afterwards. He was in Washington State. He served for 2 enlistments. While he was in the Army, he was also stationed in Honolulu, and he started writing satirical sketches for the Army newspaper. He'd make fun of people. He was a great stylist that way. And then World War I came about, and Schuyler's sort of nemesis, I would say, W.E.B. Du Bois, who, as joined the communists, became a communist and moved to Ghana and gave up his American citizenship. But he was already a socialist, and he was very much, he was one of the founders of the NAACP, but he was very much status-driven, and he made a deal through an associate at the NAACP for an officers' training school for black soldiers, and Schuyler knew that this was just intended as a show. They weren't really going to have any authority. He kept this a secret his whole life, and I kind of feel bad about saying this to people who don't really know Schuyler, but he deserted, and he spent 7 months in the military prison at Governor's Island. He was insulted by a shoe shine man, and he was just fed up with the way he was treated in the Army. After that, he moved to Harlem with his girlfriend. He was unsuccessful in getting a civil service job after that. And because of discrimination, he said, and then he moved back to Syracuse. He became a handyman, and I guess he was quite friendly with the ladies. So that was in his youth. He also joined the Socialist Party, and he was there for about a year, and then he just decided to move back to New York. Found himself kind of destitute and was taken in by a group of, people who had seen prisons, almshouses, were hobos in the Bowery. And so he does odd jobs there. They take him in. He gets a certain appreciation for this group, even though these are people who are, you know, many would say are the rejects of society, but they have this kind of multiracial, self-supporting group where you had to, you know, chip in to pay if you wanted to stay and have a place to sleep and eat. But he goes to all these meetings in Harlem at the time, and he meets A. Philip Randolph and Chandler Owen at a meeting of the Friends of Negro Freedom. And they are the editors of The Messenger, which is a socialist black monthly magazine. And after a few months starting off sweeping and cleaning, they let him start writing, and he writes this column called Shafts and Darts. And one of his primary targets was W.E.B. Du Bois. And Du Bois was the target of all the writers at The Messenger, because he was seen as a snob and someone who really didn't have the working man at heart. And there is a bit of controversy about Schuyler. There's a book by Michael Peploe, and he questions Schuyler's statements in his autobiography, Schuyler said that he was skeptical of socialism right from the beginning, that he joined the Socialist Party in Syracuse because he didn't have anything better to do. There was no intellectual stimulation. And I've grappled with this because as I read his columns, you know, so especially in the 20s and even into the 30s and early 40s, you see him espousing these very conservative views. But then he'll switch back and he'll be like, yeah, this socialist says something that makes sense. And he's kind of going back and forth. And so, you know, you kind of wonder, it's not the traditional story of, you know, someone who just suddenly sees the light and switches over. It was a little more complicated. So what I've come to realize after reading so many of his columns is that Schuyler was attracted to the socialists because they wanted to sort of get people like Du Bois out of power. Because back then, what happened was white liberals, the wealthy white liberals, would give money to a few token blacks who would be the teachers or they'd be the social workers or something, but yet the average working man could not get a job. So that's what attracted him to socialism. But he was also a realist, and he came to see what socialism really was. And, you know, he made these comments, and we could still see it today. You can take people, like today, you know, about Cuba, and talk to students and say, you know, look, communism's killed 100 million people in the 20th century. Look, they're starving in Cuba. They refuse to see reality. They're living in a dreamland, right? And Schuyler was a down-to-earth realist. He quickly saw what communism was. And even when he was a socialist, he was against the Communist Party because he saw what they were doing. So I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. So that's sort of the overall thing. In 1923, he starts writing for The Messenger. 1924, he starts writing for the Pittsburgh Courier. He eventually builds it up into the largest circulation newspaper. Back then, there were black weekly newspapers. It became the largest circulation because people were buying it because he was writing for it. 1925, 1926, he takes an 8-month journey through the South, reporting for the Pittsburgh Courier. It was called It was a series called Afro-America Today. He went into these communities, into the black sections of cities and towns, and he would talk to the leaders, the business people, the school superintendents, the principals, and get a sort of a feel for which one was prospering, which one was not, and trying to give feedback on, where, the black community, in spite of segregation, was working through their own efforts, collaborating, and improving their own status. Let's see. Okay, so 1927, he meets his future wife, Josephine. She was a white woman, and in 1928, they got married. So way before the Loving case, there was, they got married, and they lived in Harlem. And in 1927, December of 1927, so this is right before he married Josephine, Our White Folks was published in the American Mercury, which was the most prestigious magazine at the time. It was edited by H.L. Mencken. And that launched Schuyler into celebritydom. So he was lecturing across the country. I would look at his schedule, how many speaking engagements he would have in a day, plus he's churning out these articles and these columns. And there's a funny incident where a dinner is given for him by the gossip editor of the Tatler, which was a gossip sheet in Harlem. And instead of being like Du Bois, who would, just glory in this and, act like a king, Schuyler, joked about it. He didn't want to be. He said he never wanted to be a leader. He didn't want to play the same role that Du Bois did. Okay, in 1931, he is recruited to go to Liberia to report on what was taking place, and that was they called them the America Liberians. So these were the descendants, these were freed slaves and their descendants who are now the ruling class in Liberia. And what a commission had found was that they were virtually enslaving the native population and sending them off to work while they're living in this luxury, these decadent lifestyles. And so Schuyler goes there and reports on that. In the meantime, while he's there, his first novel, Black No More, which is hilarious. If you want a funny read Black No More. It's about a skin whitening process and what happens. It's so it comes out, and he's mocking Du Bois. He's he's mocking all the people in the NAACP, and he does that in a lighthearted way, but he's just caricaturing them. So while he's in Liberia, he gets malaria, comes back early. From that trip, he writes a novel based on what he saw called Slaves Today. His daughter, Philippa, is born in August 1931. They soon find out that she is a child prodigy. She is a musical genius, and she learned how many languages. She's giving her first piano recitals at the age of 4, I think. She was, written up in the leading magazines and newspapers because, first of all, they called, I think the term back then was colored, this colored child, she's a genius. And in 1931, while Schuyler was still in Liberia, because he was there in the spring, we had the Scottsboro case. Anybody here familiar with have you heard of the Scottsboro case? Yeah, the rape case, right, where 9 young black men were accused of rape. And what happened there was the communists tried to use it to their advantage. They sabotaged the efforts of the NAACP, who were, trying to get these young men from being killed in the electric chair. And they were prolonging the trial. They were, spinning it out so they could hold rallies. They had protests. They were starting riots. The black ministers that were collecting funds, all these were sabotaged by the communists, and they did this worldwide tour. And for the communists, it would have been better in their eyes if these boys and men had been put to death, because it would have gotten sympathy for their cause. And Schuyler became enraged about this, and he wrote column after column exposing them. He also, before that, did not like Marcus Garvey, who collected a lot of money and had his Back to Africa movement and thought he was going to be emperor of Africa, of the continent, right? But Du Bois wanted to be emperor of Africa. So this whole intricate story going on back and forth between them, and Du Bois, of course, had been sent over as an emissary in 1923, had been to Africa. There's also an interesting story I found out about, a grant that had been denied to Schuyler to write a book about Reconstruction that he was lied to about, said there was no money in the fund, and Du Bois had actually gotten that money. So from the beginning, because Schuyler, did not have the Ph.D. that Du Bois had, did not have the status, he, was denied the opportunities to do the kinds of projects that he was fully capable of. But Schuyler also, you can see his conservatism emerging in the 1930s. In 1930, he meets Mencken in person. Mencken had launched him into being a well-known writer. And Mencken hated Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and so did Schuyler. And that's, I think, where his real conservatism comes in, because he sees that Roosevelt is just giving these show-type jobs to get the black vote. And the publisher of the Pittsburgh Courier was given such a job. He was given an office, given a salary, but he had no say. So they were used as props, which was something that Roosevelt liked to do. Schuyler hated hunger marches, he hated street protests, he did not like boycotts, and he wrote against those. He attacked the communists. There was a group of people who were recruited to go to the Soviet Union to make this black and white propaganda film. He mocked them. He started writing serialized fiction in order to make money to survive during the Depression while other people are getting handouts. He saw World War II coming. He thought that Roosevelt was setting America up for it, and was against the war. He was an isolationist, as they called it at one time, and he was followed by the FBI and has a pretty extensive FBI file that I've gone through. He did not think that, like many conservatives at the time, he did not think that we should be allies with a communist regime. So he continues slamming communists. He gets death threats. He gets letters to the editor. He gets personal letters attacking him from former friends who went over to the communist side. Sometimes he worked with a loaded pistol next to his typewriter, right? So this was going on, back then. Okay, he also, he has a radio program. He becomes, he is asked to join the American Committee for Cultural Freedom, and goes to Europe and participates in that. And that was sort of a kind of a liberal initiative to stop communism from taking over Europe, but he and James Burnham quit that because they are too soft on communism. Okay, in the 1950s, he really started promoting Booker T. Washington's program of self-help. He starts writing for the Spadea Syndicate in 1953. In the late 1950s, he begins writing for Human Events. He travels in 1959 to the Dominican Republic. He travels throughout Latin America, South America, goes to Haiti, he goes to West Africa, he goes to Angola. In 1956, Mencken dies. In 1961, Schuyler is on the organizing committee of the New York Conservative Party. And in 1965, he is approached by this new publishing house called Arlington House to write his autobiography, which comes out in 1966. It's called Black and Conservative. He did not like the title. He just wanted to be known as an American and not black, but he accepted it. So that brings us to 1965, and so what I thought I would do is, if you don't mind, I'd like to read the opening pages of this book that I'm writing and kind of present what he was facing in 1965. George Schuyler must have been particularly incensed on August 14th, 1965, when he saw the front page of the New York Times displaying photos of young black men carrying looted merchandise and the giant headline, 2,000 troops enter Los Angeles on third day of Negro rioting. 4 die as fires and looting grow. There were 3 dead Negroes and 1 dead policeman. Oak Park Hospital, where the injured were being treated, was charged by rioters who were chanting about white devils and shooting back at convoys of guardsmen. They threw rocks and Molotov cocktails at ambulances. Police sound trucks told residents to stay inside with doors locked. On one street, flames engulfed 14 stores. At a bakery, 40 employees had to be escorted by police as they left work. Rioters attacked white motorists trapped in their cars. As in times of war, food had to be trucked in. The mainstream media's focus on black criminality, whether actual or alleged, had been a frequent target of criticism in the hundreds of black weekly newspapers operating in the United States in the 1920s, when Schuyler began his career as a journalist after 2 stints in the Army. After joining the socialist black monthly, The Messenger, in 1923, he was also hired to write for the upcoming black weekly newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, where he was still employed 40 years later, though tenuously. Schuyler had done his share of exposing how the white media ignored the Negro except when it came to crime and poverty. In recent years, as the Courier, like other black newspapers, struggled financially, he had watched with increasing frustration as white reporters eagerly covered confrontational civil rights protests, presented Negro communities as places of despair and poverty, and recorded statements of black radical leaders making impossible demands as if they represented the community, the last and old communist strategy. In 1965, The Negro again was presented as bound by primitive emotion in a perverse revival of the African blood myth of the early part of the century. After the fires had been put out in Los Angeles and stock taken, 34 dead, over 3,800 arrested, and $200 million in damages, the experts, namely sociology professors, were asked their opinions. In the New York Times, the prevalent view was expressed by William M. Hauser at the University of Chicago and Alvin Seaman of UCLA. They said that recent civil rights legislation led to expectations and frustrations over only token gains, limited largely to the middle class, and advances that were not moving fast enough. Harvard history professor Oscar Handlin, giving a view that was not deemed prevalent, stated that the riots in Los Angeles and the previous year in Harlem, Philadelphia, and Rochester, New York, were not properly race riots like the ones in 1917 in East St. Louis and in 1919 in Chicago, when groups of whites and blacks battled each other, but were manifestations of, quote, hooliganism, unchecked because of restrictions on police. Handlin's analysis, and that of the anonymous, quote, Negro handyman who told the reporters on the scene during the riot, most of these rioters are young toughs from all over the city who don't have anything better to do, were outweighed by those of the sociologists, and the latter prevailed in the Lyndon Johnson administration. In 1968, after 38 riots in 1966 and 167 in 1967, the Kerner Commission, which included Schuyler's old friend Roy Wilkins from the NAACP, would repeat in their report the claims of the sociologists. Schuyler had just signed up with the North American News Association syndicate and devoted his debut column to the riot. He expanded on the kinds of observations made by Handlin and the handyman, and drew from 4 decades of experience in aiming a cynical reporter's eye on the work of, quote, race leaders. The problem emanated, Schuyler explained, from, quote, the increasing competition between rival civil rights groups led by career agitators vying for the profits of organized pandemonium. He suggested, or the suggestions of a long, hot summer by such leaders who were aided, and these are his words, by white beatnik amoralists and malcontent leftists currently disturbing our campuses, were open invitations to, quote, hoodlums, arsonists, and vandals. He accused the self-appointed of the Negro Revolution of utilizing, quote, the traditional techniques of spontaneous disorder well known to communists, Nazis, and other political perverts. So you get a sense of his language. I mean, he's just delightful. When I was going through his papers at Syracuse University, I mean, it's so quiet in there. If any of you have done research and you have to be very careful, you know, you're handling papers, I just like burst out laughing. Schuyler did not, so I'm continuing here, Schuyler did not deny that the trumpeted evils of racism existed. In fact, they were products of our color caste system, evident worldwide. But such insurrections would not improve the situation. In fact, he wrote, most Negroes deplore the bad reputation they have been given by the excesses of the agitational and criminal elements of their so-called race. Repeating a lifelong theme about the irrelevance of racial background in the polyglot United States, he claimed that those members of the so-called separate race shared the same bourgeois values as their white counterparts. He wrote, they respect life and property, they own millions of homes, automobiles, and modern utensils, and do not cram the jails. And they know There is a lot of law in the end of a policeman's nightstick, and they want it used. The outcry against the police, he said, emboldened the Negro criminal element and harmed decent Negroes and whites. The respectable bulk of Negroes, he wrote, had been reduced to silence by the terrorism of the agitational elements. The media, meaning the white media, made it worse. They put the agitators on television and wrote profiles of them, quote, as if they wanted this racket to succeed. So, I mean, we could read this today, right? Yeah. In spite of his widely disseminated views in the black and white print media, as well as on the radio and the lecture circuit, Schuyler was never asked for his opinion. Nor did these white journalists, who had only recently discovered black issues, ask the opinion of Chicago-based Reverend Dr. Joseph Jackson, president of the 5 million strong National Baptist Convention. Instead, Schuyler charged, they sought out the peripatetic Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and, quote, his posse of political parsons in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, who roamed the country collecting coins and infecting the mentally retarded with the germs of civil disobedience, camouflaged as nonviolence and love of white people. However, phony prayers for the salvation of white oppressors and chanting slave songs fooled nobody except possibly the utopians and wishful thinkers, wrote Schuyler, displaying his lifelong hatred of slave songs. The movement, he noted, was a cover for profit and self-aggrandizement made obvious by the fact that such strategies, unlike those of the old NAACP, did not work. The Montgomery bus boycott, Schuyler pointed out, had not been settled by marching, but by federal court order. Schuyler, who had spent many years at the NAACP working as a publicist and then business manager for the organization's monthly magazine, was quite dismayed to see the once venerable organization whose brightest legal minds had won so many court cases adopt, quote, the tactics of boycotts, sit-ins, marches, and picketing, end of quote. And now in 1965, the NAACP in Philadelphia was, quote, denouncing the conservative middle-class Negroes in the organization. Schuyler blamed not only radical leaders with graduate degrees in divinity and other subjects, as well as white leftists and the usual troublemakers, but also the craven politicians, like New York Mayor Robert Wagner, who, quote, skulked through the basement of New York City's hall instead of having beatniks thrown out, and like President Lyndon Johnson, who, quote, expressed horror over the bloody orgy in Los Angeles, but did not speculate on the causes of it all. Schuyler suggested that to find the source, Johnson needed to look no further than, quote, the Negro civil rights leaders with whom he has frequently conferred, especially when they promised to suspend demonstrations until after the 1964 election. Noting that both the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Law of 65 were operative, Schuyler stated that one would expect that the protesting and rioting would have ended. However, he wrote, such evils are easier started than stopped, and they just don't go away because another law is on the books. Right? Yeah, so Schuyler's point all along was, laws, and Jay Parker echoed him as a young man. He said, all the laws in the world aren't going to change people, right? And so Schuyler was a proponent of full integration, intermarriage. He was a friend of Carl Van Vechten and admired him because he had these social gatherings. interracial social gatherings and so forth. Okay, so as I point out, of course, 1965 was post-Beatnik. It was the post-Beatnik era. It was the year of, the start of, the burning of draft cards. The Students for Democratic Society first marched against the Vietnam War, and a teach-in on the Vietnam War in Berkeley drew 30,000. And of course, there were the clashes between SNCC and law enforcement. That was the essence of his column. And I continue, though his opponents might have scoffed at Schuyler's archaic wording, Anatomy of Black Insurrection tapped into the outrage among the growing silent majority. It appeared in about 200 daily and weekly publications, including 4/5 of NANA's 150-plus subscribing newspapers and scores of other dailies and weeklies. The column brought Schuyler more than 250 letters, postcards, and telegrams. It was entered into the Congressional Record. Shortly after the column appeared, Schuyler received, this might be of interest to members here, received a complimentary letter from Scott Stanley, the young and ambitious managing editor of the John Birch Society magazine, American Opinion, asking him to write on what I have to be thankful for in America. It was, he said in his letter, to be no Uncle Tom thing, but a statement by a patriotic citizen who has managed, like millions of others, to be both a decent, law-abiding American and a Negro. Theodore Litt, Schuyler's editor at Arlington House, for which Schuyler was writing his autobiography, to be titled Black and Conservative, wrote to convey the high hopes we hold for your work. He called his column penetrating and courageous, something that would, quote, serve as a powerful force for good in our troubled American community. Schuyler was so encouraged by the success that he wrote Sid Goldberg, editor at NANA, proposing, I have the notion that I could be a candidate for the Pulitzer Prize for 1965 based on the reception of my After Watts article received nationally. He thought it marked a turning point. Schuyler, no doubt, was experiencing again the kind of boost he had had as a 32-year-old journalist when H.L. Mencken made his Our White Folks the cover story for American Mercury, and Schuyler an instant celebrity. But Goldberg recognized what kind of reception Schuyler would face in 1965. He replied that he would be glad to submit the article to the Pulitzer Committee, but added, frankly, I doubt that they would go for such a hard-hitting opinion piece, especially when it hits the nail on the head. So I've got 10 minutes to 4.
We're going to do the radio show, so we need to be out of here in about 5 minutes.
Okay, good. So anyway, then I go into, of course, Schuyler did not get the Pulitzer Prize, although I think he did deserve it. Actually, there would not be, a Pulitzer Prize given to a black journalist until Clarence Page received it in 1989, but Clarence Page sort of goes along with this sort of current political opinion. He's relatively liberal. One of the reasons that may have been, Schuyler needed to have a note from his editor, who was P.L. Prattis, at the paper, but he had been an enemy of Schuyler's since the 1930s. He was a friend of Du Bois. So they had clashed. Actually, Prattis did something that was really hurtful to Schuyler in 1964 when they had the riots in New York. And Schuyler had written to the editor of the New York Times and blamed the race riots in Harlem on agitators from the civil rights groups. Prattis, unbeknown to Schuyler, wrote a letter to the New York Times disowning him, basically saying that he is not a contributing editor, even though he had been there for 40 years, and I don't know for how many decades had been a contributing editor at the Pittsburgh Courier. But Schuyler would not go along with demands that were increasingly made to go along with Martin Luther King, right or wrong. That was in one of the letters. And he steadfastly insisted that he would not change his views in his opinion column to adhere to the position of the editors. And he suffered greatly for that. His pay was diminished. He had fewer columns. And as a result was, basically, pushed down the memory hole of history. You could not back then, as Martin Luther King was obtaining power, you could not say a negative thing about him, even if it was true. So anyway, that is sort of a hint of Schuyler's style. He was very hard-hitting, very bold. He was very creative with his language, a great satirist, I think one of the best stylists that this country has produced. I have other samples, and I think that a collection of his columns would be a great project. And I think he should be studied in English classes, history classes, Black Studies classes. And he was a great American, and there are so many ways that he was one of the, he was canceled before we had that term. He was canceled. And he is still being canceled, and the few books that have been written on him have basically misrepresented him and smeared him. But I definitely think he needs to be revived, and Americans need to know him. And we need to counter this false notion that that we can divide people up into racial groups and everyone thinks alike. So that's my objective, to bring this bold voice for Americanism back. And let me just, if you'll indulge me, this is what he wrote at the end of his Black and Conservative. This is his last paragraph. He says, "There are forces in the world that want us to fail and conspire toward that failure, which means disunity and destruction. We are here blessed with the right of mobility, the right of ownership, the privilege of privacy and development of personality, and the precious machinery of peaceful change. These gifts and gains it is the purpose of the conservative to defend and extend, lest we perish in the fell clutch of collectivism. These gifts and gains I have been trying in my small way to preserve." And that's the end of his book.